What if everything you believed about someone was built on a single, terrible lie? Maggie Sullivan's hands trembled as she set the steaming bowl of beef stew on the wooden table, the same table where her husband had drawn his last breath 3 years ago. The people of Copper Creek whispered that she was poison, that death followed her cooking like a shadow follows the sun. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. Every morning, she woke to empty streets when she stepped outside. Every evening, she watched through lace curtains as mothers pulled their children closer when they passed her boarding house. The sheriff had cleared her name, but guilt doesn't need a courtroom to destroy a woman's soul. Tonight, as the wind howled through the gaps in her weathered shutters, Maggie wondered if maybe the town was right about her after all. The boarding house stood at the edge of Copper Creek like a forgotten dream, its blue paint peeling away in long strips that fluttered in the mountain wind. Maggie had painted those walls with her husband Patrick 5 summers ago, both of them laughing as blue drops splattered their clothes and hair. Now those same walls felt like prison bars, trapping her with memories that cut deeper than any knife. Her garden, once the pride of the town, had withered to brown stalks and broken dreams. The roses Patrick planted for their first anniversary now hung their heads like mourners at a funeral, and Maggie couldn't bring herself to tend them anymore. Through her kitchen window, she watched the children of Copper Creek hurry past her fence, their mothers gripping their hands tighter when they caught sight of her silhouette. Mrs. Henderson from the general store crossed herself every time Maggie's name was mentioned, and even Father Miguel stumbled over his words during Sunday service when his eyes met hers. The isolation had become a living thing, wrapping around her heart like thorny vines, squeezing tighter with each passing day. She'd stopped going to church, stopped visiting the market except when absolutely necessary, stopped believing that tomorrow might be different from today. The letter from the bank lay crumpled on her kitchen counter, its words burned into her memory like brands on cattle hide. 3 months behind on payments, final notice, foreclosure proceedings to begin. The few travelers who still dared to stay at her boarding house paid barely enough to keep food on her table, let alone satisfy the hungry creditors circling her home like vultures. She'd sold Patrick's pocket watch last month, his wedding ring the month before that, piece by piece trading away their shared history for another few weeks of survival. The irony wasn't lost on her that a woman accused of poisoning people was slowly starving to death herself. As thunder rolled across the Colorado mountains, Maggie heard the sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats on the muddy road, growing closer to her door. No one visited after dark anymore, not since the rumors had taken root like weeds in fertile soil. She pressed her face to the cold glass and saw a rider dismounting from a magnificent bay horse, his silhouette tall and confident against the storm clouds. Lightning illuminated his face for just a moment, revealing kind eyes and a gentle smile that seemed impossible in a world that had forgotten how to look at her with anything but fear. The stranger tied his horse to her hitching post and walked toward her door with the easy stride of a man who had never known what it meant to be unwanted. The stagecoach had rattled into Copper Creek that morning carrying dust, dreams, and Thomas McAllister, a man whose reputation for buying the finest cattle in Colorado preceded him like morning sunshine. Tom stepped down from the coach with the easy confidence of someone who had built his fortune through honest work and fair dealing, his leather satchel heavy with contracts that could make or break a rancher's year. The town bustled around him with the familiar energy of commerce and gossip, but something felt different here, something he couldn't quite name. As he brushed the trailed dust from his brown coat and adjusted his hat, Tom noticed how conversations seemed to die when certain names were whispered, how eyes would dart toward the edge of town like people were afraid to even look in that direction. The Grand Hotel's lobby gleamed with polished brass and fresh flowers, a monument to Copper Creek's growing prosperity. But when Tom mentioned he might consider other accommodations, the desk clerk's face went pale as winter snow. "Sir, you don't want to stay anywhere else in town," the man stammered, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the registration book. "The Sullivan place. Well, it's not safe for decent folk." The clerk's eyes darted around the lobby as if speaking the name might summon some terrible curse, and Tom found himself more curious than concerned. He'd traveled from Denver to San Francisco, stayed in boom towns and ghost towns, and never met a boarding house that could frighten a grown man into stammering. At Murphy's General Store, the same strange reaction greeted Tom's innocent questions about local accommodations. Mrs. Murphy's cheerful demeanor vanished the moment he mentioned the boarding house at the edge of town, her round face creasing with worry lines that seemed etched by years of fearful whispers. "That woman killed her own husband," she hissed, leaning across the counter like she was sharing state secrets. "Poisoned him right at his own dinner table, she did. Sheriff couldn't prove it, but we all know the truth." Tom listened politely, but something about the story didn't sit right with him. In his years of business, he'd learned to separate fact from fiction, and this tale had the hollow ring of gossip that had grown larger with each telling. Even Sheriff Watson, a man whose weathered face spoke of 30 years keeping the peace in rough country, seemed uncomfortable when Tom pressed for details about the mysterious widow. "Look, Mr. McAllister," the sheriff said, removing his hat to scratch his graying head. "The law cleared Mrs. Sullivan of any wrongdoing, but folks have long memories for things that scare them. Her husband died sudden-like after dinner, and people need someone to blame when they can't understand tragedy." The sheriff's honesty impressed Tom more than all the whispered warnings combined. Here was a man who dealt in facts, not fear, and his words carried the weight of experience rather than hysteria. The boarding house rooms smelled of lavender and old wood, a scent that spoke of care taken even when hope had long since faded. Tom set his satchel on the handmade quilt that covered the narrow bed, noting how every surface gleamed despite the obvious poverty that hung in the air like morning mist. The furniture was simple but well maintained, each piece polished to a soft shine that reflected hours of work by hands that had nothing else to occupy them. Through the thin walls, he could hear Maggie moving in the kitchen below, her footsteps careful and measured, as if she was afraid that too much noise might remind the world she still existed. When the soft knock came at his door, Tom opened it to find a tray of food balanced on the floor and Maggie already retreating down the hallway like a ghost fleeing daylight. The meal was extraordinary, venison stew with vegetables so perfectly seasoned that his mouth watered before he'd taken the first bite, fresh bread still warm from the oven, an apple pie that tasted like childhood memories and summer afternoons. But what struck him most was the careful presentation, each dish arranged with an artist's eye for beauty, as if feeding him well was the only way she knew how to fight back against the accusations that had poisoned her life. Tom ate every bite, then carried the empty tray downstairs to find Maggie scrubbing an already spotless kitchen with the desperate intensity of someone trying to wash away invisible stains. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said gently, setting the tray on the wooden counter. "That was the finest meal I've had since leaving my mother's table." Maggie's hands stilled on the dish rack, her shoulders tensing as if his words were a trap she couldn't quite identify. She didn't turn around, didn't meet his eyes, just continued cleaning the same spot on the counter over and over again, while tears she thought he couldn't see dripped into the soapy water. Tom noticed how thin she'd become, how her dress hung loose on a frame that had once been fuller, how her hands shook slightly even when she thought no one was watching. The woman everyone called a poisoner was slowly starving herself, giving her guests the best while surviving on the scraps of her own reputation. "You don't need to thank me," Maggie whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of water dripping from the pump. "Just eat what I bring you and don't ask questions." The pain in her voice hit Tom like a physical blow, and he found himself stepping closer despite her obvious desire for distance. She flinched when his shadow fell across her workspace, her entire body radiating the kind of fear that comes from years of being treated like something dangerous and untouchable. Tom had seen that look before, in the eyes of wounded animals who'd been hurt so badly they no longer trusted kindness, and it broke something inside his chest that he hadn't even known was whole. That night, as mountain wind rattled the windows and coyotes called from the distant hills, Tom lay awake thinking about the contradiction between the woman he'd seen and the monster everyone described. The meal had been prepared with the skill of someone who loved cooking, every flavor balanced perfectly, every ingredient chosen with care that bordered on devotion. No one who poisoned people could cook with such joy, such obvious pride in their craft. As he drifted toward sleep, Tom made himself a promise that would echo through the months to come. He was going to find out what really happened to Patrick Sullivan, and he was going to prove to the world that sometimes the person everyone fears is simply the person who needs defending most. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Tom found himself walking toward the very place everyone had warned him to avoid. The boarding house sat like a blue jewel against the golden grass, its architecture speaking of better days when laughter filled its rooms and hope painted its walls. Through the garden gate, he could see a woman tending to what remained of a once magnificent flower bed, her movements careful and deliberate despite the obvious neglect around her. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work, and Tom found himself staring into the saddest eyes he'd ever seen, eyes that held depths of pain no guilty person could fake. In that moment, standing at the gate of Maggie Sullivan's boarding house with the entire town's warnings echoing in his ears, Tom McAllister made the decision that would change two lives forever. He was going to discover the truth for himself. The second morning brought courage that Tom hadn't possessed the night before, and when Maggie appeared with his breakfast tray, he gently blocked her retreat with a simple request that stopped her in her tracks. "Would you join me?" he asked, gesturing to the small table by the window where golden sunlight painted everything with hope. "I hate eating alone, and this food is too good not to share with the person who created it." Maggie's eyes went wide with something between terror and longing, her hands clutching the empty tray like a shield against the possibility of human connection. For a moment, Tom thought she might bolt like a startled deer, but then something shifted in her expression, some tiny crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. "I couldn't," Maggie stammered, but her feet didn't move toward the door, and Tom noticed how her gaze lingered on the second chair he'd pulled up to the table. "People don't. I don't." She struggled with words that had been locked away for so long they'd forgotten how to form properly, and Tom felt his heart break a little more for this woman who'd been alone for so long she'd forgotten how to be anything else. He waited patiently, letting silence do the work that pressure never could, and finally, she set the tray aside and perched on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. The conversation came slowly, like water from a rusty pump, but gradually Maggie began to talk about the boarding house that had once been her pride and joy. She told him about the travelers who used to fill every room, about the dinner parties she'd hosted for the town's leading families, about her dreams of expanding the business to include a proper restaurant that would draw people from Denver and beyond. Her face transformed as she spoke, years falling away to reveal glimpses of the vibrant woman she'd been before tragedy stole her voice and fear stole her future. Tom found himself captivated not just by her words, but by the way her hands moved when she talked, graceful and expressive, painting pictures in the air of a life that had been full of purpose and promise. When Maggie mentioned her late husband's cattle ranch, Something dark flickered across her features like a shadow passing over the sun. Patrick worked so hard to build something lasting, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But the drinking got worse after his father died, and the ranch, well, it couldn't survive what he became. Tom noticed how she chose her words carefully, like someone walking through a field of broken glass, and he began to understand that there were layers to this story that the town had never bothered to uncover. The woman sitting across from him wasn't hiding guilt, she was hiding shame, and there was a world of difference between the two. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Tom watched Maggie begin to relax despite herself, her shoulders dropping from their defensive position, her hands steadying as she poured him more coffee. When she laughed at one of his stories about ornery cattle and stubborn ranchers, the sound was like music that had been locked away in a dusty room, beautiful and heartbreaking in its rarity. But what impressed him most was her knowledge of herbs and cooking techniques, her meticulous attention to cleanliness and safety, her obvious pride in creating meals that nourished both body and soul. This was not a woman who would ever harm another person through food. This was a woman who saw cooking as an act of love. And Tom began to suspect that the real truth about Patrick Sullivan's death was buried somewhere beneath 3 years of fear, prejudice, and a town's need to blame someone for a tragedy they couldn't understand. The truth came in pieces, like shards of broken glass that cut deeper the more Tom tried to assemble them into something that made sense. During his third week at the boarding house, he noticed how Maggie always drew her water from the well behind the kitchen rather than the easier pump near the front door, and when he asked about it, her face went pale as winter frost. "The old pump draws from upstream," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to hold something terrible inside. "Patrick used to drink from it all the time, said the water tasted cleaner, but I never trusted it after they opened that silver mine up the mountain." The pieces began clicking together in Tom's mind like the tumblers of a lock, and he felt his stomach drop as he realized what she was telling him. That afternoon, Tom rode upstream to where the abandoned celestial mine sat like a wound in the mountainside, its entrance boarded up, but its poison still seeping into the ground like a slow-acting curse. The water that trickled from the rocks had an oily sheen that caught the sunlight wrong, and when Tom knelt to examine it closer, he could smell the metallic tang of mercury and other chemicals that had no business being anywhere near drinking water. The mine had closed 2 years before Patrick's death, but the damage it had done to the water table would last for decades. And Tom understood with sickening clarity that Patrick Sullivan had been poisoning himself one drink at a time, every day, for months before his wife ever served him that final meal. Back in town, Tom began asking the kind of questions that made people uncomfortable, the kind that poked holes in stories they'd told themselves so many times they'd started believing them completely. Dr. Henderson, who'd examined Patrick's body, admitted under gentle pressure that the symptoms could have been caused by heavy metal poisoning just as easily as by anything Maggie might have put in his food. But the timing, the old doctor protested, his voice lacking the conviction his words tried to carry. He collapsed right after dinner, right there at the table. Tom nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that changed everything. "Doctor, how long would mercury poisoning take to build up in a man's system before it finally killed him?" The silence that followed was louder than any confession. The real story emerged like a photograph developing in a darkroom, terrible and clear and heartbreaking in its simplicity. Patrick Sullivan had been drinking poisoned water for months, his body slowly accumulating toxins that would eventually kill him as surely as a bullet to the heart. The night he died, he'd been drinking more heavily than usual, trying to drown the guilt of gambling away half their savings on a poker game he couldn't afford to lose. He'd eaten spoiled jerky that he'd hidden from Maggie, ashamed to admit he'd spent their food money on liquor and cards. When Maggie served him dinner, his system was already shutting down from months of slow poisoning, and the timing was nothing more than cruel coincidence that had cost an innocent woman 3 years of her life. As Tom sat in his room that night, staring at the evidence he'd gathered, he felt a rage building in his chest that burned hotter than any forge. The town had needed someone to blame for a tragedy they couldn't understand, and they'd chosen the quietest, most defenseless target they could find. They destroyed a woman's life because it was easier than admitting that sometimes terrible things happen without anyone being at fault, easier than facing the fact that their own negligence in allowing the mine to poison the water supply had played a role in Patrick's death. Maggie Sullivan wasn't a poisoner. She was a victim, and Tom McAllister was going to make sure the world knew the difference, no matter what it cost him to tell the truth in a town that had grown comfortable living with lies. The confrontation at Murphy's General Store erupted like a summer thunderstorm, swift and fierce and impossible to ignore. Tom stood in the center of the crowded shop, his voice carrying over the usual morning chatter as he laid out the evidence he'd gathered about the poisoned water and Patrick's real cause of death. Mrs. Murphy's face went from pink to red to purple as he spoke, her hands clutching her apron strings like they were the only things keeping her anchored to the ground. "You're calling us all liars," she sputtered, her voice rising to a pitch that made the glass jars on her shelves rattle. "That woman killed her husband as sure as I'm standing here, and no fancy talk from some outsider is going to change what we all know to be true." The other customers began muttering among themselves, their faces hardening into the kind of stubborn anger that comes when people realize they might have been wrong about something important. The word spread through Copper Creek faster than wildfire through dry grass, and by noon Tom found himself facing a delegation of the town's most prominent citizens on the boarding house's front porch. Mayor Blackwood led the group, his usually friendly demeanor replaced by the cold calculation of a politician protecting his reputation, while behind him stood banker Harrison Wells, Sheriff Watson, and half a dozen other men whose faces showed varying degrees of hostility and concern. "Mr. McAllister," the mayor said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and warning, "you're stirring up trouble in a peaceful community over matters that were settled long ago. Perhaps it's time you moved on to more suitable accommodations." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Tom could see Maggie watching from behind her kitchen curtains, her face pale with the kind of fear that comes from watching someone else pay the price for defending you. Banker Wells stepped forward with the predatory smile of a man who held all the cards and knew exactly how to play them. "Mrs. Sullivan's mortgage payments are significantly overdue," he announced, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket like a magician producing a rabbit. "Given the current circumstances and the, shall we say, questionable nature of her business practices, I'm afraid we'll need to accelerate the foreclosure proceedings. Full payment is due by the end of the month, or she'll need to vacate the premises." The amount he named was staggering, more money than Maggie could earn in 5 years of running a boarding house. And Tom realized this wasn't just about silencing him. It was about punishing Maggie for having someone finally believe in her innocence. That evening, as storm clouds gathered over the mountains like dark omens, Tom found Maggie sitting at her kitchen table with the foreclosure papers spread before her like a map of surrender. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she stared at the impossible numbers, and when she looked up at Tom, her eyes held the hollow emptiness of someone who had finally reached the end of hope. "You have to leave," she whispered, her voice breaking on every word. "I won't let you destroy your life for me. I'm not worth it, Tom. I'm just a broken woman that nobody wants, and I can't bear to watch you lose everything because you were kind to me." The pain in her voice hit Tom like a physical blow, and he knelt beside her chair, taking her trembling hands in his steady ones. "Maggie Sullivan," Tom said, his voice firm with a conviction that surprised them both. "I've spent my whole life buying and selling cattle, learning to tell the difference between prize stock and animals that aren't worth the feed it takes to keep them alive. I know quality when I see it. and you are the finest person I've ever had the privilege to know." He squeezed her hands gently, willing her to see herself through his eyes instead of through the cruel mirror the town had held up to her for 3 years. "I'm not leaving, and I'm not letting them take your home. We're going to fight this together, and we're going to win, because sometimes the truth is stronger than lies, and love is stronger than fear." Outside, thunder rolled across the valley like the sound of distant cannons, but inside the kitchen, something new was being born between two people who had found in each other the courage to stand against a world that wanted to keep them apart. The telegram that arrived on a Tuesday morning would either save them or destroy them both, and Tom's hands shook slightly as he read the response from his business associates in Denver. Three of the most influential cattle buyers west of the Mississippi had agreed to come to Copper Creek for a dinner meeting. Men whose approval could make Tom's reputation and whose disapproval could end his career faster than a gunshot. "They're coming next Saturday," he told Maggie, watching her face cycle through shock, terror, and something that might have been hope if it hadn't been buried under 3 years of disappointment. "I told them I'd found the finest cook in Colorado, and I intend to prove it." The magnitude of what he was asking hit them both like a physical force, because this wasn't just about a meal. It was about betting everything they had on Maggie's ability to cook her way back to respectability. The week that followed transformed the boarding house into a battlefield where every pot, pan, and wooden spoon became a weapon in the fight for Maggie's future. She threw herself into planning the menu with the intensity of a general preparing for war, her notebooks filled with recipes written in her careful script, shopping lists that grew longer each day, and detailed schedules that accounted for every minute from sunrise to the moment the last dish would be served. Tom watched her come alive in ways he'd never seen before, her eyes bright with purpose, her movements swift and sure as she calculated portions and tested combinations of flavors that would showcase not just her skills, but her soul. For the first time since he'd known her, Maggie Sullivan looked like a woman who believed she might actually win. The shopping expedition to Murphy's General Store became a public spectacle that divided the town into those who wanted to watch Maggie fail and those who secretly hoped she might succeed. Mrs. Murphy's lips pursed tighter with each expensive item Maggie added to her order, prime cuts of beef that cost more than most families spent on food in a month, exotic spices that had to be special ordered from Denver, wine that made the banker's wife gasp at the extravagance. "Planning your last supper, are you?" Mrs. Murphy asked with false sweetness, but Maggie's response surprised everyone in the store. "No," she said quietly, standing straighter than she had in years. "I'm planning my first." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear dust settling on the shelves, and Tom felt a surge of pride that nearly knocked him off his feet. As Saturday approached, the boarding house filled with scents that made passers-by stop and stare, their mouths watering despite their prejudices, their feet slowing as they tried to identify the incredible aromas drifting from Maggie's kitchen. She worked with the focused intensity of an artist creating a masterpiece, her hands steady and sure as she prepared dishes that would have made the chefs at the finest Denver hotels weep with envy. Tom found himself mesmerized by the ballet of her cooking, the way she moved between stove and counter with unconscious grace, the way she tasted and adjusted seasonings with the confidence of someone who understood food the way musicians understand melody. This wasn't just cooking, it was magic, and Tom began to understand why people had been so quick to call it poison, because anything this powerful had to be dangerous to those who couldn't comprehend it. The night before the dinner, as Maggie put the finishing touches on her preparations, she turned to Tom with tears streaming down her cheeks and whispered the words that broke his heart and mended it all at once. "What if I fail?" she asked, her voice small and frightened despite all her careful planning. "What if they taste my food and see what everyone else sees? What if I really am poison and I just don't know it?" Tom crossed the kitchen in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, feeling her small frame shake against his chest as 3 years of suppressed fear finally found its voice. "Maggie," he said, his lips close to her ear, "you could never be poison to anyone. Your medicine, your healing, you're everything this broken world needs more of." As he held her there in the kitchen that smelled of hope and possibility, Tom realized that somewhere along the way he'd stopped trying to save her reputation and started trying to save his own heart from the terrible possibility of losing the woman who had become his whole world. The dining room had been transformed into something that belonged in a palace rather than a boarding house at the edge of a frontier town. Maggie had spent the morning arranging wildflowers she'd gathered from the meadows beyond the mine, their bright colors dancing against the white tablecloth she'd embroidered during the long, lonely evenings of the past 3 years. Crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts caught the lamplight and scattered rainbows across the walls, while silver that had been polished until it gleamed like mirrors reflected the faces of the 3 most important men in Tom's business world. James Morrison from the Denver stockyards sat at the head of the table, his weathered face skeptical but curious, while cattle baron William Hayes and livestock broker Samuel Crawford flanked him like judges preparing to render a verdict that would change everything. The first course arrived like a whispered promise of wonders to come, a delicate soup made from wild mushrooms that Maggie had gathered herself from the secret places in the forest where few people dared to venture. The rich, earthy broth carried hints of thyme and rosemary that she'd grown in her own garden, flavors so perfectly balanced that conversation stopped mid-sentence as the 3 men tasted something that transcended mere food and entered the realm of art. "Good Lord," Morrison breathed, setting down his spoon with the reverence usually reserved for church services. "I haven't tasted anything like this since my grandmother's kitchen back in Kentucky." Tom watched Maggie's face through the kitchen doorway, saw her hands pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob of relief, and felt his own throat tighten with emotions he couldn't name. The main course was a masterpiece that would be talked about in Denver drawing rooms for years to come. Beef so tender it could be cut with a fork, paired with vegetables that had been coaxed to reveal flavors most people never knew existed. Maggie had spent days perfecting the sauce, a complex blend of wine and herbs that complemented the meat without overpowering it. And when Hayes closed his eyes to savor the first bite, Tom knew they had crossed some invisible line from skepticism to amazement. "Mrs. Sullivan," Crawford called toward the kitchen, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Would you join us for a moment? We have questions about your techniques that no one else can answer." The invitation hung in the air like a bridge between 2 worlds, and Tom held his breath as he waited to see if Maggie would find the courage to cross it. When Maggie emerged from the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour and her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove, she looked like a woman stepping out of hiding and into the light for the first time in years. The 3 men rose from their chairs with the old-fashioned courtesy that successful businessmen learned early, and Morrison himself pulled out a chair for her with the kind of respect usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. "Ma'am," he said, his voice warm with genuine admiration, "I've eaten in the finest restaurants from San Francisco to New York City, and I can honestly say that tonight's meal ranks among the best I've ever had the privilege to experience." The words hit Maggie like physical blows, each compliment chipping away at the armor of self-doubt she'd worn for so long it had become part of her skin. As the evening progressed, and the conversation flowed like wine at a wedding, Tom watched Maggie bloom under the attention and respect of men who judged her solely on her talent rather than her tragic history. They asked about her techniques, her sources for ingredients, her plans for the future, treating her like the accomplished professional she'd always been rather than the pariah the town had made her become. When Hayes mentioned that he'd been looking for someone to cater his daughter's wedding reception, and Crawford suggested that Denver's Grand Hotel might be interested in her services. Maggie's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the resurrection of dreams she'd thought were buried forever. In that moment, watching the woman he loved remember who she really was beneath the lies and accusations, Tom McAllister knew with absolute certainty that he was looking at his future, and it was more beautiful than anything he'd ever dared to imagine. The kitchen glowed with the warm light of oil lamps as Maggie moved through the familiar dance of cleaning up after the most important meal of her life, her hands steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her completely. The three businessmen had left with promises to spread word of her extraordinary talents throughout Colorado, their respect and admiration still echoing in her ears like the sweetest music she'd ever heard. Tom stood in the doorway watching her work, and something in his expression made her heart skip like a stone across still water. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with feelings that had been building for weeks like pressure in a steam kettle, ready to explode into something that would change them both forever. "Maggie," Tom said, his voice rougher than usual, and she turned from the sink to find him crossing the kitchen with purposeful strides that made her breath catch in her throat. He stopped just close enough that she could smell the soap on his skin and see the way the lamplight painted gold highlights in his dark hair. Close enough that when he reached out to take her damp hands in his, she could feel the calluses from years of honest work. "I've tasted your cooking," he said, his eyes never leaving hers, "and I've seen your heart, and I know who you really are." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm, and Maggie felt her world tilt on its axis as she realized what was happening, what he was about to ask her. "You're not poison, Maggie Sullivan," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You're healing. You're everything good and pure and beautiful in this world, and I've been a fool to wait this long to tell you." His hands tightened on hers, and she could feel him trembling despite his confident words, could see the vulnerability in his eyes that told her this moment was as terrifying for him as it was for her. "I've traveled from one end of this territory to the other, met hundreds of people, done business with the best and worst humanity has to offer, and I've never met anyone who comes close to matching your strength, your grace, your incredible capacity for love despite everything this world has done to hurt you." The words that came next would be whispered in parlors and repeated in letters for generations to come, becoming part of the legend of Copper Creek and the woman who cooked her way back from disgrace to dignity. "Maggie Sullivan," Tom said, dropping to one knee right there on her kitchen floor, his hands still holding hers like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "Will you marry me tonight?" The question exploded through the kitchen like thunder, and Maggie felt her legs go weak as the full magnitude of what he was offering hit her like a physical force. Not just marriage, but immediate marriage, a declaration to the world that he was proud to claim her as his wife, that he wouldn't wait another day to show everyone exactly how much she meant to him. "Tom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as 3 years of loneliness and pain cracked open to reveal the woman she'd thought was lost forever. "Yes. Oh yes. 1,000 times yes." He surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen while she laughed and cried at the same time, her heart so full of joy she thought it might burst like an overripe fruit. When he finally set her down, his hands cupped her face with the tenderness of a man handling the most precious thing in his world, and when he kissed her, it tasted like forgiveness and redemption and the promise of a future neither of them had dared to hope for. Outside, the wind carried the scent of her roses, blooming again after 3 years of neglect, as if the earth itself was celebrating the return of love to a place that had forgotten what it meant to be happy. 6 months later, the restaurant that had once been Maggie Sullivan's lonely boarding house buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when dreams finally have room to breathe and grow. The morning sun streamed through windows that sparkled like diamonds, illuminating tables filled with travelers who had ridden for days just to taste the legendary cooking of Mrs. Margaret McAllister, the woman whose story had spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. The same townspeople who had once crossed the street to avoid her now waited patiently in line for her famous Sunday dinners, their faces bright with the embarrassed smiles of people who had learned the hard way that sometimes the person you fear most is the person you need most. Tom watched from behind the counter as his wife moved through the dining room like a queen holding court, her laughter ringing out clear and joyful as she shared recipes and stories with customers who had become friends. The transformation wasn't just in Maggie herself, though watching her bloom had been like witnessing a miracle unfold one day at a time. The building that had once stood empty and echoing now hummed with life from morning until night, its walls painted in cheerful yellows and blues that made every meal feel like a celebration. The garden that had withered to brown stalks now overflowed with herbs and vegetables that supplied the restaurant's kitchen, while the roses Patrick had planted so long ago climbed the front porch in a riot of red and pink blooms that stopped travelers in their tracks. Even the town had changed, prosperity flowing from the restaurant like water from a spring, bringing new businesses and new hope to a place that had almost forgotten how to grow. The letter that arrived from the governor's mansion in Denver that autumn afternoon caused such a stir that half the town gathered on the restaurant's front porch to hear Tom read it aloud. The territorial governor himself was planning to visit Copper Creek, drawn by reports of a restaurant that rivaled anything in San Francisco or New York, and he wanted to commission Mrs. McAllister to cater a state dinner for visiting officials from Washington. As Tom's voice carried across the crowd, Maggie felt tears streaming down her cheeks, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming joy of watching a dream she'd never dared to voice finally take shape in the real world. The woman who had once been afraid to leave her own kitchen was being invited to cook for the most powerful people in the territory, and the irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered the scared, broken widow she'd been just months before. That evening, as the last customer lingered over coffee and apple pie that had become famous throughout Colorado, Tom found Maggie in the kitchen where their love story had begun, her hands busy with the familiar motions of preparing tomorrow's bread. The scene was so perfect it took his breath away. This woman who had survived the worst that life could throw at her and emerged stronger, kinder, more beautiful than ever. When she looked up and smiled at him, her face glowing with contentment and hope, Tom understood that sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields or in boardrooms, but in quiet kitchens where broken people find the courage to trust again, to love again, to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The recipe book they compiled together became more than just a collection of instructions for creating extraordinary meals. It became a testament to the power of love to transform lives and heal communities. Years later, when their children read the stories written in the margins alongside measurements for salt and flour, they would understand that their parents had created something more precious than a successful business, more lasting than money or fame. They had proven that sometimes the person everyone calls poison is actually medicine, that the heart knows truths the mind struggles to accept, and that love really can conquer fear if it's strong enough, brave enough, and willing to bet everything on the simple belief that people are worth saving. The final page of that recipe book, written in Maggie's careful script, contained no ingredients or cooking times. Just 7 words that summed up everything they'd learned. The secret ingredient was always love, darling. If this story touched your heart like it touched mine, please like and subscribe for more incredible tales of courage, love, and second chances. Because sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that remind us that no matter how dark life gets, there's always hope for a new beginning if we're brave enough to reach for it.